seminar series, and it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Sue Cronin, who is going to be speaking this lunchtime. I don't want to preempt much of the content of this, Sue, but I think it's fair to say that anyone who has anything to do with teacher education or knows anything really about that side of the education picture knows this is really an unprecedented time in teacher education. Obviously, education is always under profound and quite intense scrutiny by successive governments, and that's certainly been the case, I'm sure, for a lot of the history of Hope. And Hope, of course, has been in this business for a very long time. However, there's been, I think, a change of emphasis, a change of mood or tone, if you can say that, and just a shift of, I think, pure political ideological intensity, really, and direction in terms of what's happening quite recently. So Sue is going to give us a sort of an overview of that and put some meat on the bones of that. I have to say, I think it's we're very, very fortunate to have Sue leading in one of the new areas of teacher education that we are involved in. Obviously, Sue, you've many years of experience as a teacher and as a teacher educator, so I think experience second to none in that respect. But also, we're lucky that Sue is leading on one of the newest directions, School Direct, that's happened to hit us over the last few years. She and I had an interesting experience just this morning, which is one of those experiences that you tend to get more and more at the moment, where you have to fetch up somewhere and take part in a university beauty contest. I think we're on safe ground with Sue, not so safe ground with me. I think we probably did a reasonable job of it, but it's, again, one of those strange things that you now have to do if you're in working in our sector, and I almost said business. So I think without more ado, I'm going to pass over to you, Sue, for what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting talk, and then I think there'll be time for questions and discussion at the end. Okay.
Thanks, Jane. Thank you, and thank you so much for coming. I suppose I want to share something I started, I've been thinking about a lot, and particularly as Jane said, as I face quite sharply the new kind of way of working with schools and School Direct. It does give rise to some questions and some of the thoughts. So apologies for those who are at Teaching and Learning, because it might just overlap. There are a couple of slides that I've used again. But I am interested in the challenge to our professional jurisdiction as teacher educators and our role in developing future teachers. So I think, for me, I suppose the thing is, where have we gone wrong? And I really genuinely do worry about some of the questions we're fielding about what can you do for this price, what can you do, how little do we have to do to get the qualification, and so on. There's a very interesting discourse going on, and sometimes I'm curious why we don't have the advocacy from teachers in school that we should have. So I'm going to just mention some things I'm not going to have time to talk about. There are so many different things that you could discuss and that have an impact and an influence, and we are part of a bigger picture of a different sort of neoliberal marketisation. Education is commodified. The School Direct, it's all about the market winning out, and whatever is whatever happens, the market will sort it out. And that's a real worry. So we're in the hands for sorting out the workforce in what schools decide to do or are pushed to do. And there doesn't feel like there's a strategic overview, and that's quite a scary place. Equally, there is an understanding, and perhaps that's it now, such high stakes, that teacher education is the key. A good teacher makes a huge difference, and that's now shown through research. But it's who does that teacher education that perhaps is more interesting. Okay, so as I say, I feel we're caught up in what James Noble Rogers called the perfect storm, which surrounds this future direction and position of the university within education. There's a lot of underlying conditions for this storm, this perfect storm, and it is a combination of the ideological, the political, the push for school-led, particularly with this coalition government, a new allocations methodology for who gets to have these students, and that in order is school direct, then it's outstanding schools, and then it's outstanding providers, and then good providers. And coupled with that, we have a new framework, which interestingly is harsher, and less providers are outstanding, and then guaranteed places and so on. So this is all coming together. And as Professor Viv Ellis noted, the general direction seems to be clear. Higher education's role in teacher education is under threat, and if not entirely extinguished, it is in the process of minimalisation. And he's carried out a lot of research looking at the work of teacher educators and how they sit within universities and their wider kind of remit. I'm going to read, but I thought I'd give you something to look at, and I'll say this was one of the things I want to share, because I want to start really with perhaps the teacher educator themselves, and I'm interested in this. It's my role and what we do, and I think perhaps some of this comes down to an uncertainty in teacher educators. I'm not paranoid, but perhaps sometimes you do worry about who does value what we do, where do we fit, where do we sit. I have questions in my head which are around sort of who has the right and the professional jurisdiction to actually educate and work with beginning teachers. You know, who should be deciding what is the best way? Is it politicians? Is it professionals? And I say, what is our role? So it might feel a little schizophrenic, but it can actually feel as if we are perhaps not appreciated on either side. And certainly Reynolds carried out some work, talks about this, because in a sense we sit on a boundary. We boundary span, and there are multiple facets of practitioner interaction. And it collides to some extent with the university's traditional role around research and research exposition. So there's a tension there of where we sit between these two worlds, and what's valued and what we need to be expert in. And I think those tensions are exciting and challenging, but nevertheless they are big tensions for us to face. Murray and Mail, Jean Murray, collected data from a range of new teacher educators across their first years in universities, and discovered most struggled to establish their new professional role. And I think that's something that resonated with me, and I've done some work as part of AIM at inducting maths tutors into the new profession. And there is a tension, because you go from being what Murray and Mail would say, the expert in your field, in schools, to being a novice in the world of the university. And that's a change. And they classify the work sort of changing from first order to second order. You're no longer in that classroom doing the teaching, you're back in the university talking about the teaching. So all of that needs taking into account. And I think there is considerable expertise behind us, but when we come in, we have very little research experience. I was just talking to Tony about that, and in a sense, colleagues who come in with lots of research experience behind them often have support and professional development around teaching and learning. But for the teacher educators, there isn't the mirrored support for developing perhaps research skills and even things like bidding and so on. So there's a little bit of a difference there. So it's an interesting kind of position to be in. Taylor referred to it as a sort of a Janus-faced. We're looking in both directions. And that should give us a lot to offer. And in a way, it should be something that partly gives us greater authority. And yet, in some ways, it feels as if we're perhaps not pleasing either side. And so there's a tension there. And I think it's something that we have to think about quite carefully. Pam Grossman acknowledges the challenges, and she says they're not new, which they're not. And indeed, you can look, there's lots of literature from in England, in America, and lots of challenges over time of how useful is it what we do. But nevertheless, it's perhaps getting the pace and the intensity, perhaps, of the challenge is increasing. And she says we are in danger, again, echoing Ellis, close to losing our responsibility for overseeing the preparation of new teachers. And again, she would set that within the context of what's happening on an international level, the globalisation, but also perhaps just within the field itself, in terms of what are we doing that justifies what we bring to the table, and that's what we have to do. So she comes up really through looking at the work of Andrew Abbott about certain aspects for any profession to actually demonstrate in order to retain its jurisdiction, to have that say. And so Abbott said really professionals need to show that they are effective in the field, that what they do has value. A professional body should also have a quality of academic knowledge that supports the profession. So what we're doing should be backed up, and we should be able to articulate what we do and to actually support our status as a profession. And thirdly, this area of induction, what we do to induct new professionals in. So those three aspects Abbott identified by looking at systems of professions, looking across all of them. And they sort of translate for us. And the most basic question is, what difference do we make? And I think this is an important question for us to have to answer. And it is something we definitely have just faced this morning, a school saying exactly that. What difference will you make? What value do you bring? What will you add? You know, what can you do that's Edge Hill can't do or somewhere else can't do? So, you know, they're very pertinent questions, and I think they're things that we should, as a profession, be able to articulate and defend. So we should have answers for this, but we need to be very confident in what that answer would be. And I think it's interesting that we're up against quotes such as this. And this was Nick Gibb, who is our school's minister, who said, "I would rather have a physics graduate from Oxbridge without a PGCE teaching in a school than a physics graduate from one of the rubbish universities with a PGCE." Now, you know, on two levels, I'm not sure where the insult lies. Is it with the kind of the PGCE itself or just the rubbish university? Whichever it is, it needs rebutting, and it's quite worrying that that's the lack of regard, if you like, for the qualification and for what it stands for, what it represents, for what the academic and the theoretical understanding and knowledge that goes behind that. Certainly, I've found in some of the conversations with schools, the PGCE perhaps is viewed in terms of currency rather than value. It's important to get those 60 credits rather than what we're actually doing. And again, that perhaps is a call to us to actually be more articulate and actually very clearly and explicitly defend what it is we're doing and why it is important and why it makes a difference. Okay, so I also think that to answer that question, one of the things we do bring, and in fact it's interesting, it came through a conversation I've had with one of the schools I'm in, some of the schools are with us in some aspects. One of the school direct managers or lead teachers I'm working with actually said she really thinks that the PGCE is the best model, which was interesting. But she's very conscious that they need to be involved in School Direct, so very conscious to try and make it right. However, she also recognised that in a sense, the student she has is a former pupil. She has only ever taught in that school. And so in a sense, she said, I feel I'm developing, I've got a mini-me, I'm replicating just this system. So we're producing a trainee teacher who understands this school, but this school alone. And I think that's one of the interesting aspects of School Direct. It's the localisation of the training does have some strengths, and in fact that's why it was sold that way. It was sold by the government as a solution for local needs. And there's certainly some strength in that, and for some schools that's very important, that they have people who understand the community and can contribute and share the ethos. But I think there is also a danger of that becoming quite a reductive model and quite incestuous. And the worry is that that student is actually not going to get a job in that school. So we'll have to have the skills to be able to work in other schools. Now, I'm sure they will do that, but perhaps it will be a bit more of a challenge than it might have been if they'd been on a PGCE. I think this replication, as I say, is interesting and is also a feature, actually, of the school direct at the moment. What's coming through is nearly all of the applicants are very local. And again, I think that's an even bigger reason to argue, which we do, the need for some time at university, for some space to come in and mix with others from other schools and from other, different experiences. And I think we have to push that. And actually, certainly, one of the things that I feel we have convinced schools of is the need to actually allow their trainees to come here. On some school direct models, the universities are going to the schools to do the training, and that's seen as a plus. But in a sense, that makes it a very small world that student is learning to teach. And again, for me, one of the values that we add is this important critical space in which to step outside the busyness of schools and actually have a space to think and to perhaps be a little bit more critical as well. So, question 2 is that how relevant is the academic knowledge we have? And I think this is an area where we are more vulnerable. And certainly several of the leading people in the field would argue that there isn't enough academic knowledge being generated. And we're certainly vulnerable to arguments about the nature of the research that is done in the field of teacher education, that it is perhaps lacking in some quantitative aspects, and that it's often very contextualised and hard to make any more general and specific claims. Now that, we might argue, is how it is, but nevertheless there are there's a lot of movement to suggest that perhaps we need to think about it differently. And certainly Abbott argued that the ability of a profession to sustain its jurisdiction is partly in the power and the prestige of its academic knowledge. And we've got work to do here. And I think that's work that we should be doing with colleagues right across throughout the education departments. But it is something that generally is a weakness that is thrown a lot at teacher education and about the research. David Hargreaves, as long ago as 1997, argued that education research failed to provide a sound evidence base for teaching. It was not generating the cumulative body of knowledge needed to address the complex problems of the classroom, and that some of it was not actually doing anything to impact on teachers and, if you like, on their pupils. And I think that is an area, a challenge for us, that is something we need to grasp and we need to do far more of. And this has been picked up again more recently. And one of his solutions, David Hargreaves suggested, was about looking towards the medical profession and for the kind of evidence-based approach that they used. Now, interestingly, that's come back with Ben Goldacre, who was commissioned by Michael Gove to look at how the use of evidence could be used to improve teaching in schools. There are critics, and obviously what he came up with was to use randomised controlled testing. Now, there's a lot of issues around the ethics of that, But nevertheless, at least it's raising the idea of the importance of research. And again, that is an area that we should be seeing as an area that we have authority. We should play an important role in supporting schools and teachers to become not necessarily creators of research, but being able to interrogate critically research and being able to work out, if you like, the good stuff from what Ben Goldacre would refer to as the bad science, if you like, the science that lacks any theory, just the folklore. And I think, you know, what he says there is it can improve our professional independence. So actually that's something, I think, which is a positive. And certainly he goes on to talk about this idea, which perhaps I'm not sure was quite what Michael Gove was hoping for. But actually, I don't know, because give him his due, I think this was an area he's keen that it does become more independent in some ways, even though at the same time more controlled than ever before. But again, it's about looking at evidence and empowering teachers and skilling them up so they can actually use relevant research to actually inform them and strengthen their authority and their right to make decisions rather than have them enforced by politicians. And I don't think we would argue with that. I think that's a good place to be going. Where it is tricky, and I was just sharing with Tony, I've just been in a school because I'm very keen that for School Direct we look to do something innovative. You know, if we're going to do this, we need to look at how can we develop new ways of working with beginning teachers. How can we articulate our pedagogies of enactment, what we do with our trainees that makes them better. So I went into a school that used lesson study model, and they're actually working with a university that's won a grant and are carrying out these randomised controlled tests on quite a big scale, which is one of the things that we need to look at, scaling up. And again, it should be something we're in a position to have some impact here. We work with lots and lots of schools, lots of trainees and lots of teachers, so it's all doable. They had actually been successful. So they were doing, using a lesson study model to work with their teachers to improve their teaching and pupils' performance. It was doing both. As far as they were concerned, they had a teacher that had been graded a 3, who was now outstanding. It had improved through that collaborative model. It was also making a difference to individual children who had become stuck, who weren't making progress. But she said one of the schools that had been part of the bid had not been successful, had been, if you like, the control group, had decided it was just too good to miss. So they were actually doing it anyway. And then, of course, that messes up all of the control group results. But again, that's the ethics. If you think something's going to make a difference, you're not really going to not do it with children. And I think that's something we've got that needs thinking through. But as I say, I think there's lots of ways in which this recognition of the power of research, evidence-based research, to improve teaching and learning has to be something that strengthens our jurisdiction. And as I say, Gove has actually commented on about the value. It's whether we agree with his definition and his value on different types of research. But I think it's good that this debate is happening, and it's certainly something where there are opportunities for us as teacher educators to be more actively involved. It's also interesting that it's become part of Ofsted talk. We've got different universities who are outstanding, where there's been actually some references, particularly to, in the case of Nottingham, that maintained its outstanding integration of theory and practice, and also references to their research centres. And that was the same case with Birmingham University. They have a centre for special education needs, and that was seen as a strength, this linking of the research aspects of the university that were relevant and credible and being used by schools. So again, there are perhaps some positive signs of where we can position ourselves and actually have some value. Equally, I find it slightly ironic that Michael Gove talks about this value of scientific research when one of his famous rhetoric sort of rants was about survey after survey revealing disturbing historical ignorance. One teenager in 5 believing Winston Churchill was fictional, and 50% thinking Sherlock Holmes was real. And that was one of his sort of sound bites that captures and are quite... we shouldn't dismiss them. They have a powerful effect, and they resonate, and people believe this. And actually, it was only after some considerable effort under the Freedom of Information Act, it was found that the surveys did not exist. It was one survey, and it was TV Gold. And that was where the research base was. So I think that would be a very good argument supporting Ben Goldacre's idea that we need to develop critical research skills. And I think Michael Gove definitely would there. Viv Ellis's work talked about what perhaps I think might be some of the reasons why there isn't the bigger body of academic knowledge and research. His work in following for over a year 13 higher education teacher educators looked at what they actually did, what was their work. And what he found was most of it was around relationship maintenance. And that was the defining characteristic of the teacher educators. They spend so much of their time trying to ensure strong relationships with their schools and with their students. And that's very necessary work. And I think this is where the real tension is. This puts us between this rock and the hard place, because that is key, and we know it's important. And it's kind of a part of our DNA that we do this as teachers and teacher educators. But nevertheless, what he found was that meant there was very little being done in terms of the academic work that we also should be doing, and this articulation of what we do that stands up to scrutiny. And I think that's quite a difficult tension. But it's increasingly hard as well because the pressures in schools are increasing. So as they become more pressurised systems, there is more work for us to do, particularly where there are perhaps weaker students or students that take a little bit longer to actually establish themselves. So there's even more work being done in this area. So that, I think, resonates a lot. We have work that we have to do, but that causes a lot of attention for us within teacher education, and I think that needs to be understood, but we need to address it. You know, as Ella says, that's no good enough. It can't be the case. We really do have to reconceptualise our roles and our work, and we have to find a way of doing that, and perhaps it's about trying to do that in smarter ways. His paper is well worth a read, but he talks about sort of the change in the sort of the academic marketplace we find ourselves in HE now, and that the value of us as university lecturers really is in terms of our academic capital and the research we're producing. And the danger for teacher educators is we will become the proletariat. You know, we will be too busy just doing the work rather than actually engaging with some of the serious stuff. And there's a danger of a divide coming that really shouldn't be there. And we should be contributing to that field. So that's important for us to do. Okay, question 3 is about our responsibility for induction of newcomers to the profession. And again, I think this is an area where there is more work to be done. And I think it's an important area that we have to address. Pete Boyd and others have researched and looked at the lack of induction of new teacher educators. As I say, Murray and Mayle talk about this identity crisis, this trying to balance the substantial self with the situational self. It took me a very long time to not say I was a teacher, even though I'd been in university. That change of identity is not easy. And switching roles and accepting that we are a novice and that there is work to do. It is not about trying to replicate the good teaching we did. It is trying to step beyond and then present critically different theories of teaching. That takes you out of your comfort zone. You're not doing what you know you can do really well. So that's quite a challenge for us, and it needs support. And I think very interestingly, it's an area of support we're going to need to give to school direct teacher educators. There is a new hybrid coming, a teacher educator whose actual situation is still in school. And that's a very isolated place. Anyone who comes into the university teacher education environment enters into a sort of a community of practice. There is support from colleagues. Those teacher educators in the school direct model often sit alone within the school. So that's quite an interesting area to look at and to research these new, how we support and how we ensure that they do a good job and that they feel part of an academic community and actually look at their roles differently. They are not teachers in that role, they are not mentors, they are teacher educators, and I think we have to think about that. They were kind of the areas that Abbott looked at for a profession. Obviously, there is also the political sort of threat and challenge to our jurisdiction. And there is a place for that. We have to be accountable, and we're in a democratic society. But it is about perhaps us addressing that balance and having more confidence. And again, I come back to the nature of the teacher-educator, this kind of split. Perhaps lends itself to some insecurities and that we don't have the confidence we should have because of this sort of trying to be facing two worlds and develop this expertise. But I think it's something we have to do and to make sure that we are heard, as there is a bigger push to perhaps limit our impact. School Direct is pushed very strongly as the new way, saying it's what schools want. The language is interesting. Charlie Taylor, who heads up NCTL, talks about the employers, the customers. There's interesting rhetoric, there isn't time to go into now, about the heart of the process, what kind of it pulls on these traditional values. But it is very much about schools having this the jurisdiction, the authority to choose and to pick and to decide on what the training looks like, how much they buy in, and so on. And they're the conversations, as Jane alluded to this morning, that we're now finding ourselves quite surreally having in rooms not bigger than a wardrobe, where we're packed in there, and it feels a very odd conversation about the cost rather than the value of education. And that's not trying to be harsh to schools, because schools are also in a very difficult position. And there's a huge political push on them and a pressure on them to be involved. And that's a good thing. It's just how we actually negotiate that new territory and the new roles. It's good to have schools more involved, and I think that's something we would say is an important aspect of our partnership. I think what is difficult for us is the fact it's almost implicitly suggested schools haven't been involved, when they have, and they are, and they're a big part of our partnership. So I think that's quite interesting. The politics, I'm just going to mention briefly, I just find it is interesting to see the rhetoric from Ofsted. Perhaps it's about to change again. We had a very new framework, and we've now got another one in consultation for a very, very short period of time. But the new inspection, the briefings from Ofsted were about none of the higher education institutes at the start had been awarded outstanding. That's changed now. But it was interesting that rhetoric came out, and there was a note that actually it was the schools, the school-based skits that were the most successful. That was 2013, whereas only previously in 2011, and I'll show you the quote, it had been absolutely the reverse, that it was the university sector that led the way. So something changed very dramatically, and I would suggest that was more the politics than the providers, but it was very interesting. And there was Wilshire, perhaps, as I say now, having a different relationship with Gove, but certainly here they were both backing each other up about the best way. And again, a given, I haven't time to go into this debate, you know, of the craft and the apprenticeship idea of teaching, which is what they boil it down to, or distill it down to. But, as I say, in 2011 there'd been more outstanding partnerships rather than in the employment-based route. So it's very interesting, 2011 to 2013, a complete turnaround. And that was a challenge, is a challenge to our authority and the value that we bring. And again, you know, it is interesting, but, you know, Michael Gove, and it would be very easy to just give a critique, a very negative critique, and there are certain things I think we have to recognise are pluses school involvement is a good thing. To improve standards is a good thing. But it's certainly interesting to see, and it was, his quote was about his perception, if you like, of the academics who help run university departments, seeing them as the blob, the enemies of promise. And I think that, again, is ironic, because I would argue that actually I feel we have very little influence if it's true. I think, the irony is the postgraduate course, 2/3 of the time is in schools. The site of learning is in schools. They are hugely influential, and actually we are less so. So it's very ironic that he feels so threatened by us. Janet Allen, who researched pre-service teachers in America, noted that actually, and this is work that Ken Zeitner and others have also noted, as they go through the training, a lot of student teachers come to privilege the practice in school over perhaps some of the theory. And that our challenge is actually to try and make sure that this isn't the way it happens, that there's actually more synthesis, and that they find what we do of relevance and credibility. So I think that's very interesting. That I think it's slightly ironic that Michael Gove thinks we have quite the influence we do. And certainly Brixman talks about other aspects which I think are interesting to consider, that actually the institutional biographies, the previous life. Lottie talks about a 7-year apprenticeship before student teachers arrive here. There are huge influences that have perhaps more profound influence on their philosophy as a teacher than we would. So I think Michael Gove is a little hung up on us without needing to be. To finish, because I can see my 5 minutes up, I think it is a time of challenge for teacher educators, but I think that's a chance, an opportunity. And I think we have to rise to this challenge. It is a bit of a call to arms now. We're in a position where we do have to defend and articulate our position. We have a lot to offer, and we have to address the different areas, and we have to make sure that we are in a position, because we have an important part to play in ensuring that we develop the right kind of professionals. Critical, reflective practitioners that can synthesize theory and practice, and can begin to make sense of the situations and the context they find themselves in. And I think we have a role to play there, but we can't take it for granted, and we shouldn't take it for granted, and we need to make sure we're very active. And here at Hope, I think we're well placed to do that. And I'll stop there. Stay.